Buzz, 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 buzz!
Within the memories of a wee lad, there surfaced two conspicuous objects from the briny depths. Appearing as mere bait in order to sponge oblivious fans, a wise man would have hesitated before staining his hands with licensed video games. But who gives a flip about that? It's Spongebob! So I scooped up my newfound treasures and scurried on homeward, all the while anticipating the countless innocent shenanigans the little yellow guy would partake in this time. Yeah, mutilation wasn't exactly what I had in mind. As a kid obsessed with anything and everything related to the loony loofah, SpongeBob games were likewise something I would indulge in without any hesitation. But Creature from the Krusty Krab and Atlantis Squarepantis always intrigued me. This pair seemed especially unique when compared to other SpongeBob titles. Probably because they were so incredibly weird. Developed by Blitz Games, and more specifically Team Rockfish, both titles shared a bizarre number of similarities despite their dissimilar identities. Both anxiously tested the waters with diverse gameplay mechanics, were very in tune with the Bikini Bottomites' outlandish personalities, and were generally quite surreal in their overall tone. So I decided that after all these years, it'd be nice to see whether these two oddities could recaptivate my attention like they did back in the day.
Hey, SpongeBob! Let's see if you got what it takes to beat the great Piston Patrick!
Well, I can at least forget about ever sleeping again. Across the entire series, Creature from the Krusty Krab is the sole SpongeBob game that I can sincerely claim wigged me out as a kid. Though, taking into context its confounding plot, the considerably hardcore visuals, and unsettling ambience, I doubt I was the only one who found it unusual. Our favorite coarse doofus, his dim-witted pal Patrick, and the one and only Sheldon J. Plankton are constantly waking up within weird, twisted versions of their once familiar world, where their greatest ambitions are realized as well as their deepest fears. SpongeBob can tear across the racetrack in his snazzy hot rod, Patrick can don the mantle of a superhero, and Plankton's, still romancing a sandwich, I guess? The entire adventure feels like a crazy fever dream, and Team Rockfish's rigorous devotion to maintaining that atmosphere created countless pleasant memories, for the most part. From the moment this game shot off, it was apparent why Creature from the Krusty Krab left such an indelible impression on my younger self. I mean, it's not every day you witness an all-out brawl over laundry detergent.
Lots and lots of laundry detergent!
That said, I now also realize why Creature from the Krusty Krab was never my favorite SpongeBob title at the time. Nor has returning changed that stance. As a whole, the game follows a sort of linear episodic structure, where not only our main character gets swapped out at the close of each part, but the entire scenario and gameplay mechanics in tandem. So one moment it's a 3D platformer, another a side-scroller, then a rail shooter, and even a racing game. Loyal to its world, the entire experience, no matter what it might entail, evokes an uncanny vibe and a relatively inconsistent sense of progression. A decision I believe to be simultaneously its trademark strength, as well as to its detriment. While Creature of the Krusty Krab prefers to divvy up its gameplay between these various forms, like many of its predecessors, it's a 3D platformer first and foremost. A majority of levels tend to follow the tried and true fetch quest format, where exploration is put on the back burner in favor of a more straightforward approach, suiting the game's linear structure. As such, while there are a few collectibles scattered along the way, such as the Sleepy Seeds and Snoozy Currency, the collectathon aspects are clearly a sideshow to the main attraction. Such important things as gathering this pretentious pinhead's wardrobe.
Never fear, naked citizen!
Yep, this game's weird. Both SpongeBob and Patrick feel quite good to control, and their movesets, while virtually the same and rather elementary, are distinct enough to prevent them from being too alike. However, that's all that really stood out for me. Of course, that's not to imply that these levels aren't necessarily enjoyable, as simpler gameplay has its upsides. But in terms of raw platforming, it's shockingly difficult to pinpoint anything noteworthy herein. Creature from the Krusty Krab starts things off very basic, with the entirety of the first episode coming across as a prolonged tutorial that, outside of its music and visuals, utterly fails to subvert players' expectations. Some basic platforming, basic obstacles, basic combat, basic puzzles, you get the idea. And it doesn't liven things up for a sizable portion of Patrick's world. Now, I realize this game is geared towards children, so going in I was prepared for a somewhat slower approach as well as some hand-holding. But did I really need a hint on how to deactivate the gas dispensers? Is it really that mind-bending to figure out? And the supercharge. Apparently one of the developers thought that the supercharge hadn't already overstayed its welcome, so they felt the incentive to provide both verbal and text prompts for those simple-minded players at every available opportunity.
Does it involve using your supercharge attack? Do you know that your supercharge will allow you to break through weak paper walls?
Yes, I know. It wasn't me ramming my head into blocks those 20 plus times, so you can quit treating me like an idiot. Surprisingly, the game drastically improves the moment you've unlocked the privilege of thinking. However, that doesn't address the most glaring problem, the monotony. Whether it be the combat, the puzzles, or the platforming, Creature from the Krusty Krab relies far too heavily on elements introduced within the early game. All around, the enemies are noticeably similar and incredibly easy to vanquish. The puzzle solutions are often just pressing a button or turning a winch just as before, and the platforming feels as if it's being consistently pinned down by the aforementioned puzzles. Though, to be fair, there is a hint of a silver lining here, and that's that a host of these issues could have been far worse. The combat isn't terrible in the slightest, it's just considerably mundane across the board. The cardboard chain chomps are kinda neat, but there's really only 3 types of foes you encounter, and they all more or less utilize the exact same attack patterns. Repeatedly slapping Mr. Krabs, though satisfying, isn't enough to keep things interesting for too long. Same goes for the platforming. It never seems able to competently distinguish itself from other rudimentary 3D platformers, and is consistently too easy to warrant much more than a glance. That being said, much like the combat, the platforming starts in a promising direction, for it to inevitably wind up stagnant due to a lack of innovation. But the puzzles, those are a complete chore. Again, I understand this is geared towards children, but if you're going to be implementing near identical puzzles throughout an entire game, at least increase the challenge or do something unexpected to grasp the player's attention. Otherwise, they're nothing more than roadblocks. Having to slam a button thrice as opposed to once isn't an improvement. I don't know. In regards to being a 3D platformer, Creature from the Krusty Krab is a tad trite for my liking. Fortunately, when it comes to Plankton, things take a swift turn for the better. Complementing Plankton's ravenous appetite for ultimate power, his areas are some of the strongest in terms of gameplay. Plankton acts as sort of the wild card here, as his 2 episodes have absolutely nothing in common with Spongebob or Patrick's, or even with each other. One plays out like a side-scrolling chase sequence where you're being pursued by an enraged Krabby Patty, while in the other you're enacting King Kong. And both are such a pleasant change of pace. As for the former, the platforming isn't superb by any means, but realizing there's no needless puzzles or incessant tutorials waiting at every turn is a huge relief. The blueprints and gears along the path provide a greater incentive to pay attention to your environment than the seldom sleepy seed, and the quick pace prevents the simple premise of fleeing an affordable comestible from becoming stale. It's a similar situation for giant plankton. Well, not really. Smashing buildings and zapping your enemies is just mindless fun. While much of the raw enjoyment comes from Plankton's sinister glee as he rampages across town, it demonstrates that suddenly swinging a playstyle in a wildly different direction can be a positive move if properly integrated. Which is a trait I really wish could be attributed to the racing and flying segments. Perhaps the fact I'm conflicted on them is somewhat unsurprising given how frequently I've complained about vehicles and platformers, so I admit there is a way you can implement said features where it isn't offensive. Just meet the rest of your game's standard of quality. As for the racing, it's not the worst. It's just present. While the game claims these are races, they behave more like time trials that fail to meet their own modest expectations. Again, the ease and repetition are what hold it back. But I'll give it this much. I take a mediocre race any day over a long-winded flying section. Though preferably neither one. Beyond a handful of minigames, these flying episodes are the only other moments the gameplay takes a sudden shift. and they're among the few times that I can genuinely say I really didn't enjoy Creature from the Krusty Krab all too much. And it has all to do with its wanting performance. The camera violently swerves to and fro, it seems like you're constantly dealt damage left and right due to its wonky hitbox, and overall, the fights themselves can feel very drawn out at times. If there was only one thing I could criticize, it's that Creature from the Krusty Krab never seems to evolve upon its primitive ideas in a meaningful way. Save a slight increase in difficulty in Plankton's roles, it often seems like you're doing the exact same thing from start to finish, with the majority of deviations being purely cosmetic. Towards the beginning, this is obviously less of an issue, but when a gimmick is already wearing out its welcome before you've even finished the prologue, that's not a good omen. It's as if Creature from the Krusty Krab intentionally shuffled its gameplay around to compensate for an overlying lack of substance. This is made even worse when two of the weakest links are lumped towards the end as opposed to being more evenly spaced out. I believe that decision prevented the game's climax from being as impactful as it otherwise could have, and by all means should have been. So, generally speaking, Creature from the Krusty Krab is a bit of a lackluster experience in regards to gameplay alone. There's several peaks as well as dips, but overall, it's peculiarly unremarkable, which serves in stark contrast to virtually everything else this abstract entry undertook. Alright, I was very critical of Creature from the Krusty Krab, in spite of my true feelings towards the game. Still, I don't regret anything I've said thus far, as I believe that at its very core, the gameplay is incapable of standing on its own accord. Nonetheless, Team Rockfish handled everything else brilliantly. I'm not going to cover the story in detail since I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but wow. Whereas the show has its fair share of episodes that delve into more mature topics, only a few of the games have ever implemented these somewhat darker themes. Creature from the Krusty Krab bucks that trend and goes all out, with seemingly little regard to all the nightmares it'd be inflicting upon younger audiences, myself included back then. Every area's art direction is alien from anything we've seen from the series. From the gritty punk get-up of SpongeBob's world to the comic book aesthetic of Patrick's, Creature from the Krusty Krab knows how to craft intriguing environments and consistently pulls it off. Of course, that doesn't mean it always manifests as something most would consider appealing, but what's a kid's game without a little horror splashed in? That's the one thing I can even praise the driving and flying segments for. Their cinematic nature amplifies the sense of urgency and chaos that the story seeks to get across. Just by looking at the load screens, you can easily tell that the people who worked on this game's art had incredible vision. The same goes for the music. While personally not my favorite score, the Movastic soundtrack aptly fits this unabashedly bold title, and the way it sticks out from the series' other music makes it all the more memorable. Yet what I appreciate the most is how Team Rockfish managed to throw these beloved characters into zany new scenarios without compromising their personalities or the series' comedic identity. The game relishes in its slapstick humor, and for the majority of time is performed in very good taste. Their interactions with the new and returning cast are consistently engaging, and to this day, I'm still wondering when we'll witness the momentous return of the dreaded Patrick, or any of these other one-off characters. After all these years, we still don't have answers as to why this guy married an ironing board.
Take my wife, please. No, seriously, you can take her.
At the end of the day, Creature from the Krusty Krab is a very mixed game that'll likely leave vastly different impressions on different kinds of people. Unless turning winches for eternity is the pinnacle of gaming for some, I don't see players who are primarily interested in the platforming mechanics getting anything substantial out of this. Though, in terms of its world building, the overarching plot, and character integration, Creature from the Krusty Krab is phenomenal. Altogether, its poignant music, eye-catching art style, and the kooky characters provide a uniquely immersive experience despite the game's repetitive nature. For me, that was more than enough to stay invested towards the very end. So, kudos, Team Rockfish, you managed to turn an otherwise mediocre, monotonous mass into something special and close to my heart. Well done.
We're number one! We're number one! Hi, everybody. Welcome to Atlantis Squarepantis.
Alright, Atlantis Squarepantis is eccentric, I'll give it that much. After the freak show that was Creature from the Krusty Krab, Blitz Games was tasked once more with creating a new Spongebob title, this time revolving around the highly anticipated Atlantis Squarepantis. For those who don't know, Atlantis Squarepantis revolves around Spongebob and his friends exploring the lost city of Atlantis. And that about summarizes it. Really, if you've seen the episode, the game follows a near identical pattern, give or take a few changes, which in my humble opinion was a fatal mistake. Alright, but backing up. Before starting this part of the review, I want to preface that I'm not one of those people who resents Atlantis Squarepantis' very existence. As was the case back in the day, I'm fairly indifferent when it comes to both this game and its corresponding episode. And this prevailing apathy comes down to how they both play out within their respective media. So, let's get into it. Akin to Creature from the Krusty Krab, Atlantis Squarepantis is an amalgamation of starkly different styles of gameplay following a linear progression. However, unlike the former, we're provided an actual map this time around that allows you to freely select between available missions. Additionally, if you accomplish these said tasks within a specified time or attain a high enough score, you're awarded a scale of medals that can be used to redeem goodies in the shop. So, on the surface, I really appreciate these alterations. In spite of Creature from the Krusty Krab's ever-changing nature, beyond furthering the plot, the achievements never felt all that rewarding to me personally, which is something the medal system addresses here. Plus, now you can customize SpongeBob's getup for the startup screens. Never mind, I already hate this. As for what these missions actually encompass, they tend to be one of four things. You have vehicle-themed levels, such as where you're guiding Plankton's ice cream-toting tank outside of the Atlantean armory, top-down puzzles, where you alternate between each character's unique skill set to reach the goal, first-person shooting segments, which is the last thing you'd expect to be featured in a SpongeBob game, and as the glue that firmly binds them all together, button sequences. My favorite. Going in, I thought Atlantis Squarepantis would be a rather uninspiring adaptation of a relatively uninspiring episode. But shockingly, it wasn't nearly as egregious as I had predicted. When it comes to the tank and bus levels, they're leagues ahead of Creature of the Krusty Krab's vehicles. While not spectacular by any stretch of the imagination, they at least fulfill what they set out to do in a basic, somewhat fun way. Keyword fun. Same thing goes for the puzzles. Nothing amazing about them, but also nothing terrible. Just a pleasant little diversion and a definite improvement over Creature of the Krusty Krabs. On a similar note, there's an arcade you can unlock in the shop where you play these cute mini-games with chibi versions of the main cast. Though this is bonus content, I thought it worth mentioning here since its gameplay shares several common factors with the former two, being short, sweet, and to the point. On the contrary, the latter two have a greater tendency to absorb copious amounts of screen time, for better or for worse. So, the positive. Dedicating 2 entire segments to snapping pictures and pelting bystanders with sandwiches might seem like random throwaway inclusions, but they're ironically some of the most complex and compelling gameplay sections Atlantis Squarepantis has at its disposal. They control pretty well, take full advantage of their environments, and don't overstay their welcome. Unlike something else that's way too confident in its own inabilities. But yeah, the best part is a photography simulator that actively awards you for vandalism and assault. Great kids game. Now, on to the thumb grinders. Initially, this does start off as a real rhythm minigame where you're actually mashing the buttons to the beat. And besides Squidward's wrong notes and Plankton singing with his mouth shut, there's nothing wrong here. But it's the only time staying in rhythm is ever a priority. Soon you'll get to click your controller for the next 15 minutes while the characters walk in a straight line, and the inputs have practically no correlation to the song that's playing. Grueling, mind-numbing, and repetitive. If developers want to rely on something menial like this, at least make it interesting like Squidward's posing. Or, I don't know, have it function like an actual rhythm minigame? Because this gets nauseatingly tedious after a while. To be fair, I technically haven't experienced everything Atlantis Squarepantis has to offer, so maybe it improves somewhat, but there's a very specific reason for why I stopped after completing the story. As you trade in medals, you eventually gain access to a class of secondary missions which behave as alternate takes on the primary objectives, which is a neat inclusion in and of itself, but the way you acquire them is obnoxious. Everything in the shop needs to be unlocked in a fixed order, which means that an ample portion of the game is haphazardly shuffled between concept art, cosmetics, and best of all, audio commentary. Why? And since each medal rank counts as separate, that means you'll likely need to complete certain missions, as well as their spin-offs, a minimum of 3 times in order to unlock everything. Now, I gave Team Rockfish's prior endeavor a lot of flack for being monotonous and stretched out, and those are traits that Atlantis Squarepantis equally addressed and somehow made even more problematic. Yet, I believe the cause for the majority of this game's shortcomings are the mission's misguided purpose. The levels are mostly composed of what are essentially mini-games. Whereas some are complex enough to substantiate their placement, the enjoyability of others is completely compromised since they lack enough structure to justify their extensive duration. It's not the button sequences themselves that are the issue, it's the fact it crawls for nearly 20 minutes. If these were spaced out and treated like actual mini-games, I'd wager the pacing would have substantially improved. Now, I realize as a Spongebob game, the plot isn't going to be all that compelling, nor is it even a necessary feature at times. But the story is outright problematic here, primarily due to how accurately it portrays the source material, but also as a consequence of some questionable choices made by Team Rockfish. So, on to the former. In defense of Team Rockfish, I believe their interpretation of the story was more tasteful than the show's, foreshadowing the impending conflict at the very beginning allows the build-up to feel more natural, and the subtle changes to the way certain scenes play out enable your audience to gain a more effective outlook on this mysterious world as opposed to singing half the time. That and the Scooby-Doo reference is a really cool nod, I've gotta admit. But even in this case, it's Atlantis Dead Pantis, and a clear downgrade from Creature from the Krusty Krab's riskier, yet arguably more satisfying approach to storytelling. You can tell Team Rockfish was desperate to rescue the game's story, yet I'm actually not all too sure what they could have implemented that would have prevented their project from suffering the same fate as the episode. However, they did take one peculiar course of action. So, on to Team Rockfish's side of things. I'm gonna play a series of clips for you guys and see if I'm the only one who notices something that's slightly off-putting.
Hi, gang! In this level, Patrick and I explore the caves under Bikini Bottom. This level is all about the magical flying bus.
Alright, I'm not trying to be a jerk about this, but what in the world were they thinking here? There's so much I detest about this freakish animatronic ninny. Not only does he spoil what the upcoming levels have in store and continually press you on what to do despite there being instructions smack adjacent to him, but he completely derails every cutscene by breaking the fourth wall. Why go to the trouble of animating scenes when you're going to immediately reiterate everything that just happened therein? That does nothing but destroy your story's potential for providing an immersive experience, a place where Atlantis Squarepantis is already at a disadvantage. As some pros to balance this tiresome strain of cons, the art direction and music do provide the game with a distinct and pleasant identity, the museum's vast collection of displays and the sleek otherworldly Atlantean architecture being a few personal highlights.
Oh, at last, some culture! See you, losers!
Given Team Rockfish's proficiency at creating strange and wonderful environments, I cannot overstate how much this helps. And the character interactions and dialogue contribute to some genuinely satisfying moments. Yet, even so, they're incapable of fully compromising for the shoddy plot and the game's obvious failings. It's bereft of the prior's cohesiveness throughout many of its levels. The menu and transitions somehow undersell the game's teetering quality, and Mr. Krab's lack of dialogue is incredibly distracting. In fact, he's playing creepy. What even is this expression? Replaying Atlantis Squarepantis wasn't an awful experience, despite everything I've been ranting on about. It's just both the game and corresponding episode are such misplaced opportunities. There are definite highlights like the museum tours, visually appealing environments, the music's enjoyable, and it's generally inoffensive. Yet that last factor is what prevents it from surpassing its current woeful status as a subpar game. If you're going to actively waste the player's time with monotonous snooze fests and feature a grossly inconvenient system for unlocking content, an adequate experience is not enough to save your project from falling apart at the seams. As is the case for the world building, pleasant music and creative set pieces can't persuade me that this is anything more than a glorified collection of minigames forcibly tied together. When you're integrating a story, it's essential your levels not only feel naturally connected, but most importantly, aren't drawn out and devoid of purpose. I'm aware these are mostly repercussions from adhering to the show, but some of this was the fault of the developers. and it's quite depressing, as Atlantis Squarepantis can be enjoyable and boasts a lot of charm. Allow players to access the side content more readily, restructure the pacing of your levels, bury the obscene Spongebob model, poof, better. So after re-experiencing these two as an adult, I now know without a shadow of a doubt why they were so memorable back then. If nothing else, Team Rockfish had a knack for creating eerie and unnerving content. Once you've seen one of their games, that memory will stick with you no matter how intensely you might wish you could burn its accursed image. Yet for all their talent relating to world building, neither Creature from the Krusty Krab nor Atlantis Squarepantis succeeded at providing consistently engaging gameplay. Overall, Creature from the Krusty Krab is a bumpy ride with exceptional artistic flair. And as for Atlantis Squarepantis, it's there. It could have been great, and it can be fun, but it's chock full of flaws. Anywho, tell me what you guys think about how Blitz Games handles the SpongeBob franchise. Since I've now drudged past these two, I'm ready to see what lies in store for the little yellow guy. But until next time, thank you all for stopping by. God bless and happy gaming.